Okay. Um, so I'm going to take quite a bit of time, maybe as much as half of the talk, to walk through a personal timeline of evolution. And it's not just me telling a backstory. It's actually going to highlight sort of the need for an improvement and sort of how I went about making the improvement and sort of where I am now. I expect that at some point along this timeline, you will go, no, I can't accept that. That is either bleeding edge or that will never happen. We will never do it that way. And some of you and many of you, maybe most of you, maybe. um and I think that's the point I'm trying to make, is that things are dramatically different now than they were. I was part of launching the agile movement, and when I first started talking about agile, people were like, yeah, no, that's never going to happen at my organization. And we all sort of know how that happened, and we're in a similar situation, except the adoption curve is much faster. And that's part of the vibe I'm going to try to get you with this timeline walkthrough. So I was an early alpha tester of GitHub Copilot back in 2021, which is, I think, the first year it came out. And it was like IntelliSense plus plus. You would start typing an API call, and you wouldn't have memorized the signature order of parameters, but it would look at the few lines above it, and it would guess what things from that would be most appropriate. It got a little better than that maybe a couple of years later. I learned, or either that or I just learned, that if you started typing comments about what functionality you were about to write, it would learn from those comments, and it would try to write more than one line or two lines of code at a time. I think it was 2023 when it wrote a whole function and it got it right first try, one shot. So that's a pretty slow curve, but it was useful right from the get-go, and I kept using it. Then November of 2024, 16 months ago, basically now at this point, so not that long ago, there was an inflection point for me. This is when Sonnet 3.5 came out. And it was the first time where I felt like the LLM was able to understand the goal I was trying to accomplish, and was able to really, really dig into the context and be much more of something I could delegate to. So early, but still, it was a tipping point. But it was still amazingly early on this curve. So this is a score of essentially how right the LLM gets it on first try. And back in that November 2024 timeframe, it only got it right 14.9% of the time. Now we're up into the low to mid 70s on when it gets, because this is Sonnet 4.6. There's actually Opus 4.6 out, so a little bit better than that. I'm not sure if it is on this score, but the curves all look roughly the same as this, no matter which metric you look at. So that's a 5x improvement since the time that I described as my tipping point. And so and that was only 16 months ago, and that was several years after it first became usable. So started a month later, so 15 months ago at this. Oh wait, did I say 2024? Yeah. A month later, I started letting it write large blocks of code, like whole tasks, whole PRs. But I didn't trust it, right? I reviewed every test. I wrote some of the code, like examples of the patterns I wanted. I definitely reviewed every type definition. I didn't necessarily even review every line of code, but I reviewed every test. And so if I knew the test coverage was good, I had more confidence the code was probably okay. And I looked for architectural smells and those sorts of things when I did my reviews. 15 months ago. 2 months after that, so 13 months ago, I started trying to evolve the process by which the agents were working. And this is where I think most people are today, is really sort of they're at this stage of development. They've been tweaking their agents.md for a while, or their Claude.md. Maybe they've discovered skills and they're hand editing those markdown files. And this was very powerful because you could essentially set rules, guidelines, constraints upon what you wanted the agent to do in terms of how it wrote code and the process by which you used. And skills, even later came more recently, allows you to actually define sub-agents that will do things a little more autonomously. Skip ahead 6 months or 4 months, I guess, from the last timeline point. And I realized that the number one bottleneck in my process was that I needed to give the agent more capability to review its own work, to assess the quality, security, whatever of its own work. And I realized that the tools that I, as a human, favored using were not ideal for it. I noticed it would add, console.logs to my code when it wanted output because it didn't necessarily have a easy way to sort of know how to use a debugger. And so I started creating some tooling. I brought back to life this Luminize brand that I had essentially last committed to on NPM at least 10 years earlier. And I published 2 more libraries under this namespace on NPM, one for debugging and one for testing. And this is essentially just 2 of the maybe dozen or so things I did to give the agent the ability to evaluate its own work better. Skip ahead to October 2025, just what's that, 5 months ago, 6 months ago, something like that. And this is where I start to lose people when I give this talk. I started getting the agent involved in modifying the process by which we were developing together. And so I added these 4 retro questions that it was required to answer before it declared victory on any phase of the PRD document, or the task file is what I call it. And the end result was, the last question was, what should we change about the current process, agents.md, skills files now it says, et cetera, to see that this thing that went wrong or didn't go perfectly could be avoided in the future. And so there was this like a meta feedback loop. I would describe this. Here's a slide essentially describing the same sort of thing, just with a little more detail. This is essentially the next step, I think, that most people are at this point is start to do retros with the agent after every phase of development. And when I say phase, these are typically, I'm doing these usually 2 to 5 times a day kind of loops, maybe a little less than that when I have a bigger file. Occasionally it's once a week kind of thing. If I have a huge thing with lots of interdependencies, I can't do it incrementally, but I usually figure out a way to break it down and get feedback sooner than that. So not only do I have this sort of micro adjustments of the process as we go, I have 2 other feedback loops that sort of, think of these as concentric circles of feedback loops. And weekly, I on Fridays, I look for ways to improve the ability of the tools to validate its own work. So I'm looking for better testing capability. I'm experimenting with projects. I'm going to talk about one a little bit later. Automated red teaming, et cetera. And then once a month, I basically say, okay, I've read about this cool thing over the last month. I'm going to essentially do nothing today but sharpen the saw. And we're going to, on the first Monday of every month, and I'm going to essentially try a completely new thing. In October, that was trying out Cursor. I was previously still using Copilot. I was using all the Anthropic models on Copilot for a while before that. As I said, Sonnet 3.5, 16 months ago or so, we sure was like my inflection point. But it was Sonnet 3.5 inside of Copilot. Then I switched to Cursor, which is a library, and it was great. A new IDE, sorry, it was great. But it cost me $500 in the month of November, so I figured there might be some improvement there. And I also was finding I needed the IDE less and less, and so I switched to Claude Code in December, and I've been on Claude Code ever since. I'm not really thinking of changing that. I'm really very happy with that now. No IDE. And that's sort of a subplot. Um, and then just a couple months ago, I started designing my own subagents using the skills feature that what first came out under Claude Code, but is now supported by all of the coding agents out there. In fact, they use the same format. In fact, there's a repository called Tessel by the founder of AppScan, which is also the same guy who founded Sneak. He has a repository for skills files, .md files. You can basically install them, and they're curated, and they're looking for sort of data security. The skill says dump your data, dumps your passwords to this. That would not be allowed inside of Tessel. So it's a little bit of a way to borrow skills, share skills without so much risk of doing that sort of off the internet. And I got to this point where I would spin up twice as many agents whose job was to call the baby ugly of the agents that were developing the code. And there's two different kinds of agents that are developing the code, exploratory ones and actually code writing ones. And then there's roughly three different flavors of verification agents, validation agents that I have running. And the job of the validation agents is to, while the code's being written, and even more so after it's written, but not the whole task file is done, its job is to find flaws in it. Security flaws. One whole agent is dedicated to security. I haven't adopted Anthropic's security tool yet. It was closed beta last time I checked a couple weeks ago, and hopefully that's for my next Monday. We'll be adopting that and using that, integrating that. So why separate agents? This is really important. And it sounds like in talking to Julia before we got started here, the last speaker talked about AI, has said something similar to what I'm going to say here. So the agents are essentially, think of them like human emotions. They get an endorphin rush when they accomplish the goal. And so the agents who's responsible for developing are going to take shortcuts. They're going to get to the goal as quickly as possible. They're going to delay, the resolution of technical debt. They're going to basically get their endorphin rush by saying, "Yes, I'm done. I did what you." So you have to have other agents who get their endorphin rush by finding problems with the stuff that the first set of agents are developing. And this has been incredibly enabled by the fact that it'll now automatically spin up subagents based upon how you define the subagents in Claude Code. And other folks I haven't used them yet because it hasn't even been in Claude Code very long. I think January is the first time this was possible in Claude Code. And then everyone quickly followed. But it will make decisions about how many to spin up. And roughly 30 at a time is pretty normal for me now. I did try to push it and force it to spin up a lot more than that, and it was sort of diminishing returns and wasn't really providing the value of not incremental value. 30 is sort of where I am, and that might be my problem. It might be a limitation with my process, my subagents, how they're defined, or it could just be that's where the tech is at this point here. And so this slide is essentially a summary of what I've been saying for the last few slides. And this is sort of my chance to draft with you guys and see. Please give your feedback in the comments, whether you like this name or not. I've only used it for a few weeks now. Systemic agentic engineering is sort of what I'm describing here. Systematic, self-healing, ISO 9000 vibe. I'm going for a Deming kind of feel here. Feedback loops, not just on the code itself, but on the process by which you're developing the code in several different dimensions of that. And also on the success of the product in the market is also an element of feedback loop that is not explicitly called out here because that's not the nature of this talk, but that's definitely something on our minds. In fact, there's a gentleman on the call here. I see his name, Troy McGinnis. Troy is with Usage Tap is working on this aspect of it pretty aggressively. So we'll be collaborating more on that going forward. Okay, so here's the objection I've gotten most of my career. I like to say my predictions of the future are never wrong. They're just sometimes premature. So that might be a year ahead of schedule. It might be 5 years ahead of schedule, whatever. Um, I'm going to try to argue that I'm not that much on the bleeding edge this time. Anthropic is having 100% of Claude code Claude and Claude code are being written by their own tools. They're by Claude and Claude code, and they're also rewriting at least Claude code every few weeks from scratch. They're basically taking the existing app as the input to a rewrite that would be better architecturally, better engineering, etc., enabling features that were impossible with the current architecture without it being rewritten or large portions of it rewritten. And so they estimate that less than 20% of the current code in Claude code is over 3 months old. And so it's 80% of it has been rewritten in the last 3 months. Okay, so that's the timeline. That's the sort of like set the stage of how fast things are moving, maybe scare you a little bit about where you are in your own evolution of doing things this way at your organization. Now I'm going to talk about the implications of this at the sort of organizational level mostly here. So Anthropic has been saying for a while now, coding is solved. Now, I don't really like that wording because the word coding, no, it's a little off for me. Is a solved problem. And I would actually say that coding was never the bottleneck. It was learning was the bottleneck. But even learning to a large degree is solved by agent use. Troy was telling me a story the other earlier, actually, where he's every so often, every few months, he's asked the agent, "I have this great idea. I want to build a phone, except I want to put the keyboard right at the bottom of the screen." And for I don't know, months and months and months, years maybe, it said, "Oh, great idea. Let's do that." BlackBerry style, right? And now you try to give it to any of the top LLMs, and it says, "No, that's an awful idea," and it gives you reasons why it's not. So even the learning aspect is not a bottleneck anymore. So what are the bottlenecks? And then there are 3 of them up on the screen here. I would say that architecting for evolvability is really important. I wouldn't necessarily call it a bottleneck, but it's a really important role or skill that people need to bring to the table. You can very quickly paint yourself into a corner of technical debt with just vibe coding constantly. And so if you have a person who's a great subject matter expert as the leader of the effort, without somebody who's sort of looking out for these architectural, especially evolvability, don't paint yourself into a corner problems. Take shortcuts, accept some technical debt intentionally, but don't make it so much that the debt subsumes your ability to continue to evolve. You have to have people that care about the process. And of course, the community on here, some of them come from the PSP, TSP days. And I was a PSP, TSP guy. And, the process was very important to me. And even Agile was a process also. And I took it as in that same regard. So those people who are good about thinking about that, maybe the focus shifts to more integrated with tools, and maybe not everyone's so good at that aspect of it who's been working in that field for now. But integrating the process with the technology is really a key skill that we need to have. These are the people that I described every first Monday of every month. I try something completely new. These are the people that should be doing that, and then finding the ones that work and then sharing it with the rest of the organization. And then, the skill of managing agent swarms, so how do you kick off a bunch of agents and get them to actually work productively towards the goal? So those are skills that are important. And these are represented by 3 of the roles here. pretty heavily that I've mentioned here. The flow engineer is essentially the process improvement person. The evolvability architect, I think, is the exact same word. The verification adversary is similar to what I mentioned before. And the solopreneur, entrepreneur, this is the person who, and this is like the target vibe coder now. This is the person that really has a great idea. This is often somebody that's in an enterprise, and maybe they're a mid-level manager and they have 5 employees. They can't, afford to go through a purchasing process to buy a expensive tool. Maybe they don't even have time to execute the purchasing process. It might take months at their enterprise. And the pushback they get is, oh, well, we have Jira and we have Salesforce. Can't you just configure it to do what you need it to do? And but in a weekend, they can build a tool that's exactly what these 6-person team, including themselves, need. And it doesn't have 90% of the waste and all of the sort of mental, translation you have to do to get Jira to do it the way to even be somewhat useful for them. And then they can add double the features that are not even in Jira or Salesforce that actually are tailored to what they're doing. This is the key person, I think, that sort of, brings together the product owner role from Agile, but in a very, product owners today are very much product managers or project managers. Unfortunately, that's not how Agile was originally envisioned. But they're not just subject matter experts. They're not just domain experts. And this really makes that subject matter expert being the leader of the team come true, actually be more true than it ever was before. So who falls into the crevices that are opened up in the earth by the fact that the earthquake has hit? The folks who really are, know every nuance of every syntax of every advanced syntax of TypeScript, utility types and recursive types, etc. And that those skills are no longer really important. The LLMs know them better than anyone ever will. So the way we go about hiring today developers is fundamentally wrong because it focuses a lot on these kinds of things. The manual or even the automated QA engineer, that role sort of goes away. These folks have to get comfortable with writing agents that do their job for them. That's a little bit further down the road. That's probably not the next few months, but maybe the next year. Automated pen testing. I'm going to show you a slide in a little bit. This is actually, here today for at least certain tech stacks. And, they do it better than you possibly could get humans to do it, the very best humans to do it. And the average pen testing organization is not the very best. And things like bug bounty, you pay by the tier of the bounty hunter that you are hiring when you pay for bug bounty. You don't need to do that anymore. You really can automate that. This is the last one, the integration plumber, is still a little bit further off. And this is actually the new focus for Luminize, my product. Luminize Nebula is the name of the product. It's make the right thing to do be the easy thing to do, and make the easy thing to do be the right thing to do. A lot of times the agents will deploy to whatever platform you ask it to, or if you don't ask, it'll deploy to AWS or Railway or Fly.io or Cloudflare or whatever it chooses. And those platforms allow a lot of flexibility and a lot of power, and they're not necessarily strong guardrails for them. And I think platform engineering is a really key element to doing this securely and higher quality. And I think that that's the role that's sort of going to replace the current DevOps guy who is really technical and able and capable, but really needs to up level to this higher level capability of platform engineering, I would say. Okay, so now we're going to pivot again to another section of this deck, and I'm going to talk about how the compliance and security landscape in particular has changed. The first of these is actually probably the least important of these. I think to a certain degree, this is less true here in the States under the Trump administration, who's very interested in deregulation. the European Union is a little less inclined to that. They're more into regulation, and there's been a big shift over there. Now, eventually, the European compliance sometimes makes it over to the United States. Think about the privacy laws. California Consumer Privacy Act was modeled largely after the European Union offering an equivalent before the California Consumer Privacy Act came out. And a lot of states have adopted a similar California Consumer Privacy Act now. That's not happening with these right now. I don't see that happening. So this is a little less important in the United States here. But the flavor of this, I think, is actually spot on. It is essentially a get out of free jail card right now. If you say, well, we're just doing what everyone else in the industry is doing. We're doing reasonable and customary. If bad things happen to our users, our EULA saves us from that as long as we're not, negligent. And so that basically makes it very hard for companies to feel much pressure to avoid cyber attacks. Also, what's happened is that the successful exploits have gotten so frequent that the period of recovery from the pain of one of those is down to a few days. It used to be you got a 20% market capitalization hit on the stock market, and it was a year before you recovered. Now it's barely a blip on your record. It's just so common. It's just become not important, and so it's really hard to get attention. Well, what the European Union is doing is trying to shift that. So the problem, if a bad thing happens to a user, they don't have to go through a big long lawsuit process. They don't have to prove damages. None of that occurs. The law actually triggers based upon the event, and it's adjudicated immediately, and it's based on sort of preset values for certain types of events happening. If it happened, regardless of whether you were negligent, you're going to be liable for it in the EU here going forward. Again, this is the least important of the ones. I probably shouldn't have spent that long talking about it. And as we go through the rest of these slides in this section, they get more and more important, I think. The SaaS apocalypse. Does anyone know when that was? That was just like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. It's like, feels like old news now. Maybe you guys are not familiar with the phrase SaaS apocalypse. But basically there was a 20% downward motion in SaaS vendors in one day, and it extended for a few days actually. So it was on the orders of closer to 30% before it was all done. Some of them recovered a little since then, because all sort of reactions like this are overreactions. But basically what happened is they started to realize that Jira and Salesforce, that an entrepreneur could build a tool like this in a weekend, and that they needed, and they wouldn't need these big SaaS vendors that are charging, hundreds of dollars a seat as much anymore. And so it really sort of more impacted their revenue model. And so there was a big reaction to it. The key survival metric here is speed. If you are a SaaS vendor, you got to be, out ahead and moving faster. You got to be taking advantage of these things faster than your customers are going to. And then this is probably the most important one in this section. We've been building towards it, is that the bad guys are doing this now. They're using all this capability right now. If you don't start using it, you're going to be, you're behind them. And so it's really a sort of a fight fire with fire message that I'm giving here. So there's some really great examples of people doing this. I gave you some examples earlier of doing this in the small with my adversarial verification sub-agent model. But Google is having thousands of agents literally crawling through the mono repo continuously all day long and finding really significant things that have been in there for years and resolving them. I was on a panel with the guy who's responsible for launching this program a few weeks ago, and he talked about this extensively on the panel. And then Anthropic just, their new tool that I said I'm not in the private beta for yet, they use this tool to find 500 0 days, some of which had been in the code bases for over 10 years. And these are things that have had lots of scrutiny, and nobody found them. No human found them, and they were able to find them in an automated fashion. So if you can find vulnerabilities as a white hat, then the tools are available to black hats to find vulnerabilities as well. And so if you aren't using them to try to find them on your own products before they try to find them on your products, you're essentially screwed. And so you got to start doing this as quickly as you can. I'm going to talk about some bright news on this front. This is a Project Shannon. I encourage you to, if you're in the security side of this, if you're real concerned about this, I encourage you to go check it out. It does have some limitations in terms of tech stack and such. So keep that in mind. But the experiments they did on it is they took code bases with enough CVE history to sort of be meaningful statistically. And they went back to an earlier version of that product. And they put Project Shannon to work. Now, Project Shannon's not an LLM, so it's not been trained on the CVE database. It's got no evidence of that. It's literally a trial and error kind of pen testing tool. It does do white box, though, so it does have a static element to sort of crawl through your code base to look for possible entry points and such. So it's a little more than just an external only kind of pen tester. And it found 96% of all those CVEs on its own. And so if you're running this on your products, you're going to find 96% of the CVEs before they ever become CVEs, and they're still sort of pre-released kind of thing. And it's much faster and much cheaper than human pen testing costs or services that could possibly do this. Again, it's got limitations in terms of tech stack. And I don't necessarily trust their statistics completely because of the way they set up the experiments. But they're still impressive numbers, and this is great technology. And I would encourage you, if they don't support your tech stack, to create a pull request and submit it to Project Shannon, so that it does work with your tech stack. Okay, so I'm getting close to the end of my deck here, and I'm basically going to make a strong distinction between vibe coding and what I've been talking about here today. I think this is systemic agentic engineering or systematic agentic engineering. I believe it's very different than prompt and pray, and it's not geared towards just spitting out something that looks great in a weekend, but doesn't necessarily become something you can build and rely upon. And I think this is where it's going. Where the guardrails are a structural property of the platform you're deploying to, and that the feedback loops are on both the product, adversarial agentic subagents, the process, having the main agent give you a retro at the end on what we can improve to prevent the problems that happen in the future, and then on the market side of things, feedback at that level. How well is your product doing in the market? And maybe put multiple versions out there, A/B test live in production with real users is sort of the place that this is going. When you can create 3 different versions of the product, I didn't even talk about that evolution in my process. But when I have something where performance is critical, or where I just don't know the performance characteristics, I often have it build 3 different versions of the thing. This is much more valuable if you can do that in the marketplace and put 3 versions of the product out there, 3 versions of the marketing pitch out there, and see which ones do better.